In 1982, I was living in New York City. I was 33 years old, and I couldn't have been more of a complete failure. I would have been the first to say so. My primary definition of failure, for me, was that I wasn't published. The fact that I wasn't making any money didn't matter to me as a defining characteristic for success or failure. The fact that I was between romances, didn't have a girlfriend at the time, that didn't define me in terms of being a success or failure. The fact that I was unpublished was a big thing in my life. I had to break through that. I was only an aspiring writer until I got published. I knew this was the case. I never pretended otherwise. I was very harsh in arguments with friends. They would say, well, you're writing all this stuff. You've got this pile of unpublished manuscripts already. You've got all these rejection slips. That shows you're a serious writer. And I said, no, it shows nothing. Proves nothing. I'm not a writer by saying I'm a writer. I'm a writer when I'm published, and I'm not published yet. So I was in New York. Why? Because that was the place to prove yourself. There were plenty of writers, of course, who had never gone to New York. Maybe better writers, in a sense, because there was so much redundancy of New York writers, people writing about New York, people writing about wanting to be writers and living in New York. It went on and on. Also, I was between girlfriends and was somewhat heartened one day when a former girlfriend took pity on me and introduced me to a woman she knew. She'd lived near this other woman in LA. They were both aspiring actresses. They both had little nibbles here and there from the world of TV commercials, the legitimate world of the stage. Little nibbles of interest they both had. The woman I was introduced to had landed a huge part in a Hollywood movie, which went on to become a big Hollywood hit with big stars. Some people's careers were made from that movie. Hers very likely would have been as well. She had the second female lead, and then a change was declared from the top. The producers or somebody fired the director. The new director brought along his two girlfriends to be the two female leads. So this woman I was just meeting in New York in 1982, at that point, several years in the past already, had lost her big chance. That was the one that got away, that she never stopped thinking about. I hadn't yet had one that got away from me of any sort. I hadn't been dangled the offer of publication of one of my novels only to have it yanked back from me later. That would happen in time, but it hadn't yet. She had had this part, and now all she had to brag about was a few big-time TV commercials in the past that made her some money for a while and then went out of use. And she had gotten a film credit for that movie where she was supposed to have had the second lead. When the credits rolled, all these names going down so fast you can hardly read them all. Hers was there in small print. Girl in Disco, it said. And that, so far, was her career in movies. And her career on stage. That was her career, that one line. She wasn't an extra. She had played the part of the girl in the disco. I was full of sympathy for her because I was a total failure myself. I didn't have a credit in anything. I wasn't known to the world. Unknown commodity. I had not even reached the point in my life, those halcyon years when I was a New York City cab driver. If you can believe this, as a peak experience time, I was considering becoming a taxi driver, but hadn't quite yet, always collecting more rejection notices in my various novels. Meantime, I had this girlfriend. She didn't get too many calls for auditions in commercials, but she got some and didn't get the work. She didn't get any calls for legit work on the New York stage, which is what she really wanted to do. Of course it was. She didn't want to sell soap flakes or toilet paper. But she would have been happy to get any work at that point. She had done several commercials in LA and they had made her some money. But her life hadn't been particularly happy there. She'd had boyfriends there, she told me, who were all married men, producers and people like that. All married men. It sounded like a savage life for her. She is an attractive woman. We had things to talk about, things to see, and we were sympathetic to each other's plights. She made her living, her day job, as we say, was working for a catering outfit. And one day, hanging from a coat rack by her front door, I noticed a creamy-colored golf cap. I said, "That's a nice cap. Where'd you get that? I didn't notice that there before." She said, "You're very observant. That wasn't there before. When I was catering this job out in the Hamptons, someone left it behind, and I just brought it home with me." I tried it on. It fit nicely, which is unusual. I have a fairly large head, had even then. But this cap fit. I looked inside, and it had come from a shop in Paris. Very Tony address in Paris, I figured, not far from the Arch of Triumph in the Champs-Élysées. And there was some writing in it. The signature of the person who had given this cap to his friend looked tantalizingly familiar. It said, "To Kurt V," Kurt with a K, V, from Saul St. And I realized that this Saul St. had to be Saul Steinberg, one of my favorite artists, who had designed many covers for the New Yorker magazine, a fair number of cartoons inside New Yorker magazine, wonderful line drawings, one of the most brilliant artists in New York. And here was a cap that he had given to Kurt V, who clearly must have been Kurt Vonnegut. I said to my girlfriend, "Was Kurt Vonnegut there at this party?" She said, "I don't know. He might have been. There were lots of celebrities there. This was in the Hamptons. I didn't see him there." "Why? Does hat have something to do with him?" And I said, "It does, yeah." "Do you think I could use this hat? Would you give it to me?" And she said, "Sure, you can have it. It fits you, right? You look good in it. Keep it." And so I put it on, admired myself in the mirror, but I wasn't going to wear it. I had plans for this cap because everything in my life was desperately twisting on the minimal glint of a chance that I might finally be published in New York. Why was I living in New York if not to be published? Why would anyone live in New York, I often ask myself, if not to break into some art form? New York was the nerve center. Later on, when I drove a taxi, I would frequently have editors from various publishing houses in the taxi. We'd have friendly conversations, literary conversations. We'd discuss our favorite writers. They'd ask me who I like to read, and I would say, well, Flann O'Brien. And we would have discussions, and I would send them my manuscript of one novel or another if they'd been interested in it, maybe my railroad novel manuscript. And they'd reject it in a kindly way, a vicious, kindly way, because no was always exactly no and nothing else. My agent would get these rejections and would relay them to me with her regrets, because she wasn't an unkind person. She wanted me to get published too. She knew I was good enough to be published, or she wouldn't have taken me on as a client. She was a legit literary agent. I don't know what sort of legit writers she represented, but she seemed to be on the level. So anyway, I wrote Kurt Vonnegut a letter. And in this letter, of which I retain a photocopy all these years later, were glued 2 photos I had taken of myself wearing Kurt Vonnegut's cap. I'd taken them not using my own camera, but in one of these photo booths that they had in those days, in train stations and in the subway, various places. And my letter passed along the offer to him that he could have his hat back if he read the enclosed manuscript and got back to me and told me what he thought of it. He didn't have to love the manuscript for me to give him his hat back undamaged. I wanted him to have his cap back because he had gotten it from this wonderful artist, Saul Steinberg. I wanted to reunite the great author, Kurt Vonnegut, of whose work I had read maybe 2 books in college, and then I'd lost interest in him, as most people do after college. Vonnegut is a passing interest to most people. My theory is that people like him about the time they like, who was that German author who wrote Damien? Hesse, Hermann Hesse. He was much in vogue during my college years in the late 60s, early 70s, as was Vonnegut. And then I, anyway, lost interest in both of them for different reasons, but they seemed to appeal to me at this jejune age of 20 or so. Now, Vonnegut, I also had some gratitude towards. He had some influence in helping me lose my virginity at the age of 18, with partial thanks to one of the ideas in a Kurt Vonnegut novel. I think it was Cat's Cradle. It was a cute idea. In my early 30s, looking back, it seemed to me that Vonnegut novels were filled with cute ideas. That was the problem. They were cute novels. I didn't say this in my letter to him. I didn't say, I've enjoyed your cute novels and your cute sense of humor. Because I knew he was a gloomy man. I didn't want to make him gloomier. You could tell by reading his novels he was a gloomy guy. I was often a gloomy guy myself. I didn't want to add to some other writer's gloom by being nasty. I didn't say anything about his writing in my letter. But clearly I was hoping he would help me. I sent him his letter and my manuscript in care of his editor, Seymour Lawrence, at the Delacorte Press. I had not yet been rejected directly by Seymour Lawrence, but I would, in the future, be rejected by him. But he evidently liked my own cute letter well enough that he passed it along to Kurt Vonnegut with my manuscript. Then, December 5th, 1982, I received a letter from Kurt Vonnegut with this outlandish, fanciful signature that Vonnegut loved to sign. You could make out a K and a, I don't know. Anyway, it's in red ink. Along with a letter that in itself was not at all cute. In fact, he got the title to my novel wrong, which irked me. My letter had said, Dear Mr. Vonnegut, this is a letter of mild extortion. Through an unlikely series of events, none of them illegal, I recently came into possession of your cap, cream-colored, of fine, nubby material, which you lost and must miss. I'm holding it hostage until you satisfy my non-negotiable demands. The demands. 1. That you read the enclosed manuscript novel Midnight Turning Day, and 2. Respond either face-to-face or in writing to said novel, criticism, etc. The cap in captivity. The spots in the photo at left are due to careless handling by my photographer. The cap itself is spotless. Identifying marks. The rear label on the cap reads pur-lin, infroisable. The larger label reads Moch Fils, 42, 42, Avenue Georges V, Paris, with the handwritten inscriptions for Kurt V above and from Saul St written below. My agents tell me the donor must have been Saul Steinberg. You are lucky to have such a friend, but enough. I hope you will reply soon and not bring any hardship on your cap. It is a nice cap, and we at RCD, that was also up here in my return address, RCD, which of course is a reference I knew Vonnegut would recognize right away, a Henry Miller idea, roving cultural desperados, which I felt myself sometimes to be, certainly during this episode. We at the RCD would hate to see anything mean happen to it. Your cap, this is my threat portion of the letter. Meanwhile, it stays in its closet, but well fed. Please keep the police out of this affair, as their interference would only cause damage to your cap and heartache for your family. For your convenience, a stamped, self-addressed envelope is enclosed. I was good at enclosing those for getting my manuscripts back when they were rejected. Patiently awaiting your reply, I am R. Mosier. Well, when I got his reply in the mail, and it didn't come to me in Brooklyn, it came to me, I was staying at a different address in Upper Manhattan by then, not the address of this girlfriend. She was on 75th Street, but this came to me on West 106th Street, I remember. In any case, it says here, Dear Richard Mosier, I have read Midnight Turning Into Day, which wasn't the correct title. I'm not an editor or an agent and have never persuaded a publisher to take on anyone, so I am a blind alley as far as the future of the manuscript is concerned, which was total hogwash, of course. He knew it and I knew it. If he'd wanted to help me, he could have given me help. My opinion does not matter. You can clearly write as well as anyone ever needs to write. The railroading scenes are excellent. It does not seem to me that you are in this case a sufficiently entrancing storyteller. 2 words. The fault is very likely my own, yes, but I could not care very much about the characters and their concerns. If I have offended you by saying so, you can, of course, destroy the hat, his only cuteness. Yours truly, Kurt Vonnegut. With the... So, he had read it. He had sent it back. I was honor bound to return his cap to him. It wasn't a hat. It was a cap. It was a golf cap. It was a linen golf cap, and it was a thing of beauty, especially since it had been signed by his good friend Saul Steinberg. But he didn't mention Saul Steinberg in his epistle. He didn't want to get poor Saul Steinberg involved in this whole imbroglio with some poor failure of a non-writer. But he was trying to be nice. I learned later, when I pieced it together, that his wife probably wanted him to be nice because she was an appreciator of all things cute. I had to return his cap to him. I had said I would, and I was going to. I couldn't, in good conscience, go on wearing it myself. Would have made a story, but a pathetic story. How was I to explain to people the truth of the story, which was that it was just one more instance of deep rejection, this time by a writer I had stopped reading because he was too cute. I had just liked him in a passing sophomoric phase of my own. I knew he was an anti-war character. I sympathized with him there. I was anti-war myself. I didn't realize yet how deeply wounded he had been by the war himself, in ways I'd say similar to Salinger. I still admired Salinger and would go on admiring him the rest of my life. I still admire him. I've reread him. I've not reread Kurt Vonnegut. I haven't reread Hesse. But I sympathized with Vonnegut. He was miserable being an American with Reagan as our president in the 1980s. He was miserable with our stupid wars here and there. Vietnam, especially Vietnam. So on a cold, windy Saturday morning, my girlfriend and she wanted to meet Kurt Vonnegut, evidently. She hadn't cared if he had been at this particular hoo-ha in the Hamptons or not, but she wanted to meet him now. Now that I had gotten a letter from him, I was something now. I'd gotten a letter from Kurt Vonnegut telling me he didn't like my novel. She wanted to go along, and so we made our way together to his brownstone building on East 48th Street, a creamy brown color, just a sliver of a building, very narrow from the street, with half a level down as a basement, and then 3 levels above that. You go down several steps at that house, or you did then, to the servants' entrance, appropriately enough. That was where the buzzer was. And a woman came to the door, a young woman. And I said, I have something here for Mr. Vonnegut. I'd like to give it to him if you don't mind. And she said, well, I'll take it for him. I'm his assistant. So I handed her this brown paper bag in which I had put the golf cap. And my girlfriend and I turned and walked away down the sidewalk on this cold, early December, late morning in Manhattan. A morning for losers in New York, to be walking down a cold, windy sidewalk. And we'd made it a couple 100 feet when this poor girl who had answered the door, college girl or out of college and probably desperate herself, aspiring probably herself to be an actress maybe, or a writer, God help her, came tearing after us. Without putting on a coat first or anything, she came tearing down the sidewalk after us and said, oh, they want to meet you. They want to meet you. Come on back. She was much more friendly now. She hadn't been friendly at all before. She'd been used to turning people away who wanted to see the great author. So back we went. I could tell my girlfriend was feeling a little more excited. I could feel my gloom rather deepen at the prospect of meeting them, whoever they were. Maybe the guy was married, I didn't know. So we went back, we went down these stairs and into the house. Having escorted us indoors, the young woman introduced us to an older woman who was indeed the wife of Kurt Vonnegut. And this woman was full of energy. She wanted to meet us. She wanted to meet the guy who had written Kurt this lovely, witty letter. What an idea. Brilliant. Well, she meant cute. I knew she meant cute. It had been nothing, this letter. A desperate attempt to get a little chisel edge, a little knife edge into the possibility of acceptance in the literary world. I knew it was pathetic. I used cuteness, I used anything I could find. Desperate. I was desperate. I was forlorn on that morning of December 8th or 9th or whatever it was. I don't know if they offered us coffee or not. The great man hadn't arrived yet. His study was on the top floor of the brownstone. And then, shuffling down the staircase, came this sad, tall figure, this gaunt figure of, yes, indeed, Kurt Vonnegut. I hadn't reckoned on the fact that he was going to prove to be so tall and so skinny and so desperate looking himself, poor guy. He looked so sad. And it looked as if he hadn't had any sleep in a month, poor fellow. Maybe this cap fit him, maybe it didn't. But it was not the cap of a happy man. I kind of felt for him for an instant, but not too much, because I knew I was about to walk away down that same blowing, gray sidewalk. We didn't exchange much in the way of pleasantries. We shook hands. I said it was nice to meet him. which it wasn't really. It wasn't a pleasure to meet him. It wasn't a pleasure to meet her, Jill Crements, his girlfriend, his wife. I was the one with the girlfriend. He was married. Many years later, and I mean many years later, 30 years later, by which point Vonnegut had died and I had at long last been published, and I was even married. A biography of him came out, and I read it with some interest because I was curious to see if he had really been as sad when I met him as he seemed to me to be. If this version of his life is to be believed, it turns out he was desperately unhappy. His miserable marriage and whether he was going to get divorced at that period or not. They were separating, they were back together. It wasn't schadenfreude to read and find out that he had been miserable too when I was miserable. Walking to his house and walking away, then walking back, and then as my girlfriend and I did, then I don't think we did drink coffee at their house. I just remember how stooped and sorrowful Vonnegut had been when he arrived down those steep steps. He'd had to stoop to fit in the room, it seemed. The ceiling was low in the ground floor, the basement where we were. Being a short fellow, I was fine. I didn't have to stoop. I've never had to stoop all my life. It was his gaunt frame and his sunken eyes and the fact that he hadn't slept in 7 weeks. And maybe he was on antidepressants, who knew? Drinking too much, smoking too much. He had a cigarette in his hand. He knew it was a desperate moment for me. He knew it was a failing moment for me, on top of many other failures. He saw my misery just as I saw his. We shook hands. We told a few small social lies, and as soon as was practicably possible, I said, well, we needed to be going. He must be busy. We'd be on our way. No one stopped us, and we were back out on the sidewalk without my brown paper bag, and we made our way off into the cold, gray December of Manhattan. Within 2 or 3 weeks, she broke up with me, and our romance was over.